Wonderful. Great. Thank you very much, Wanjiku, and thanks to everyone for being here. Evan, thank you for accepting our invite and for joining me in this conversation. We'll keep it very light, have a few questions I'll ask you, and then we'll throw it open to the audience. Tabitha, please, because you weren't able to ask your question the last time, happy for you to go first as well, and then we'll conclude. But to start off, very curious about your journey into behavioral science.
Hello? Hello, hello? Okay, can you hear me? Okay, I can't hear it, so, okay. Great, okay, my journey. Well, first off, before getting into that, I just want to say thank you for inviting me. It's been great to be here. I've been here a little over a week now. We got to do a writing workshop, and I got to meet and chat with a lot of other folks from Busara about their projects, sit in on sessions today, and the welcome has been amazing, and the chance to learn more about Busara in person has exceeded expectations. So thank you. A little bit about my journey. Basically, I got really interested in behavioral science as an undergrad, like many people, and this would have been in 2008. I was doing my senior thesis, and I was contemplating doing a PhD, and then I interned with a friend who was doing a psychology PhD, and I was sitting there, and I was in a windowless room, and I was like, could I have this for the next 6 years of my life? I don't really know. I think I want to see the world a little bit. So fast forward, an organization like Busara didn't exist yet, and so I would have probably joined this organization had I could when I graduated, but I couldn't. So I did a little something called Real World College, and I think it's kind of in the spirit of behavioral science. I'll say a little bit about it, but basically the idea was college is 4 years. It's kind of arbitrary. The courses you take are kind of short, and you learn a little bit, and sometimes you stick a little bit longer, sometimes you stay later, and you kind of get to pick and choose. And I said, I'm kind of going to do that for life a little bit. So I tried to pick a bunch of different weird jobs. I was a night security guard at a rodeo in Denver. I was a sign holder, literally the person twirling the sign on the side of the road. I was doing it was like a wellness center, so I was doing yoga poses. If you ever were in suburban Denver in 2010, then you probably saw me. I lived in the middle of nowhere in the Czech Republic. I knew nothing about it. I ended up moving there after that. So trying a whole bunch of different stuff. And the idea was, at the end of those 4 years, just like at the end of college, you kind of figure out what do you want to do next, right? You actually have a time point where you say, hey, this is where I'll make a decision, and I'll kind of chart the next 3 or 4 years. And so after doing that, I came to that point, and I knew I would come back to psychology and behavioral science. And I was like, okay, I want to get back into it. What can I read? So I went to the bookstore, and I looked at the shelf, and there was kind of two versions of what I would call, it wasn't even called behavioral science then, but there was kind of a science is cool, like neuroscience, the brain lights up type of content, and there was very, very fluffy, self-care type content that wasn't really rigorous. And I was like, where's all the stuff I was learning about behavioral science on real-world problems in school, and it needs to be doing something, not just sitting in the ivory tower. And so basically with my brother, who's a more traditional journalist, we founded what was called the Psych Report then, and it was basically what the behavioral scientist does, but for psychology, tries to bring expert commentary about their work, so it doesn't stay hidden, to a broader audience. Fast forward, we did that for a few years off the side of our desks, basically as a passion project. I was still doing some of that Real World College, coaching soccer, and doing things like that. Then I moved into research, but eventually it became the behavioral scientist, and it became my main gig. And the mission is really trying to find the people who are asking the most interesting questions about human behavior, try and find the people who are trying to solve the most interesting behavioral challenges all around the world, and kind of create a platform where all of it can come together. And I think there are kind of two main missions. One is bring all the ideas to a broad audience, so it can kind of pollinate our ideas, whether we're behavioral scientists or designers or just curious, and it's something we like to read more about. But the other thing, and I think this really applies to the folks in this room, is we really want to cross-pollinate the behavioral sciences. So there might be people in anthropology working on climate change and economics and psychology. And as you know, they probably don't talk to each other ever. And yet imagine spending 40, 50 years of your career thinking about the same thing as your colleague in another building on a campus, and you've never actually exchanged notes. And so that's why I think events like this, organizations like this, are really great for that cross-pollination. And so, anyway, that's the accelerated version, even though it was long, I'm sorry, for how I ended up in this chair, I guess.
Great. Thanks for that, Evan. Really interesting. You've had very many identities, Evan the watchman, Evan the sign holder. Thinking about your current roles and current identities, Evan the writer, Evan the editor. Could you tell us a little bit more about your process, your writing process, or your process when you're editing a piece as well? What do you look for? What techniques are you able to share?
Sure. So I think I'll start as an editor, because I'm mostly an editor, and as an editor, you're not usually on the stage, and if I am on the stage, I'm usually in the interviewer position, not the interviewee. So as an editor, you're usually behind the scenes, and you're asking a key question, which is, what is this person trying to say? What is the author trying to say, or authors? And how can I help them say it more effectively? How can I help them discover things about their thinking that they didn't yet know? Can I ask them questions that deepens their own thinking? And so as an editor, I'm always trying to, once we're in that process, really just deepen a piece. And I think one other thing that you have to do as an editor is you're kind of we heard about the end user this morning, and you're basically the voice of the end user. Is this interesting? Do I care? Why now? All of those questions you have to ask of the author, and it's the author's job to answer them, and you're kind of helping guide them. But as an editor, really, it might be easy to say, oh, I'm just going to make it so the person writing feels really great and this and that. But that's one person, and then there's thousands and thousands of people who are going to read the article. So really, it's in your best interest. You really have to translate what they want and will help them in their lives, and communicate that in a way to the writer that's effective. So it's a lot of question asking. I think there's one really important thing, which is just trying to develop your own sense as a reader of what gets you interested and excited. So if you're reading an article and you're like, oh man, I feel like I should be reading this, but it's boring or it doesn't connect, notice that basically and say, what is it doing that didn't make me connect? And if you read one that you're like, oh my gosh, I just read a 5,000 word article for the last half hour and I didn't even look up or check Facebook or something even once, try and go back and figure out what was the author doing that kept your attention. And so I think often when we're writing, and even in the research world, we have this kind of take your medicine is kind of a heuristic we have, even though we don't know we have it, which is, oh, if it's important, I should be interested in it. If it's important, I should read it. But there is an engagement factor, and important things don't need to be boring or uninteresting or put us to sleep. And so really, I think leaning into what makes you engaged. As a writer, that's just a tough thing. I don't know if there's any easy way to do it, but basically it's, I think, taking some of the things as a reader of what really makes you excited and try and translate that onto the page. And really, there's one bit of advice that one of my favorite American authors gives, Kurt Vonnegut, which is basically care about what you're writing. And his point isn't like, I care a lot about all of the problems that we cover in behavioral scientists, but personally, there may be not all like a strong connection. But you can find a personal connection in the things that you care about really deeply. And that caring and like probing for that is going to go a lot farther than further. I'm an editor, I should know this. Further than any tricks you can do with language or style things. It's like really the reader's going to know if you care. And so that's something that I think goes through as a reader. You can figure out if you care. As an editor, you can ask, do I care? Will the reader care? And as a writer, you can say, do I care about this and why? How can I communicate that?
Wonderful. You've referenced having this end user, in mind as a writer and an editor. I think you're referencing what Yatin was talking about. Moku, as well, in the previous session, was talking about storytelling, right? So, and the importance of it. So, what role does storytelling have to make behavioral science research more accessible, more impactful? What kind of stories have you been seeing in the last 5 years or so? What big stories in behavioral science are you seeing?
Yeah, I think storytelling, and maybe as you guys are all thinking about it in your work, it's really important because that's what we're going to connect on, basically. That's what we're going to remember. And I think there's one thing that's kind of important to think about, and there's a good example. There's a book on immigration from the U.S. called by these two really interesting economic historians, and it's called Streets of Gold. And in America, we have this huge, rags to riches mythology, or we have the opposite mythology, which is that immigrants are causing crime and things like that. So we have these kind of very two polar examples. And what they've done through in their book and a lot of their research is they've actually found what's the more average immigrant story in the U.S. And what they did, which I thought was extremely smart in their book, is they then said, okay, this is kind of how the average immigrant, this is how much money they kind of had when they came. This is the jobs they had. This is how their kids had upward social mobility in the second and third generations. This is when they kind of kept the names from their culture. This is when they changed it to maybe more American sounding names. They could kind of figure all that out, but then they went into the data and they figured out they plucked out a data point and they actually told a person's story that was representative of the data. So they were basically replacing these kind of very polarizing myths about immigration that were very strong in the mind and very prevalent on news and stories and things like that. And they're replacing it with more accurate ones that were representative of the data. So as all of you are kind of doing your research projects, I wouldn't think of necessarily storytelling has to be, the one outlier that is like, above and beyond everything that you found that's going to really wow funders and things like that. Maybe you need to deploy that at some time strategically. I'm not saying don't do that. But also think about how can you find the story within your participants that represents, hey, this is really what's going on here, and be able to tell that story so people have that as a mental model for the data that you've actually found. It's kind of a way to find that bridge.
Cool, thank you. As you were saying that, I kind of got reminded of a question Stan had in the last session, actually, of what's the challenge or what do we risk if we don't tell these stories as well? So for you, as Busara, as a research organization, as researchers, what's the risk you see? And what's the perception you think that, as an outsider, folks have of Busara, right? And perhaps what's the opportunity then for us to become better storytellers of Busara's story as well?
Sure, that's a great question, and I think I have a couple different ideas, and especially I've been here and been able to talk to more people. One thing that's become extremely apparent that you probably already know, but maybe someone from the outside repeating it helps. You all have amazing stories of what you're working on, and I think right now, if I could convey something from what I think I'm sensing in the U.S. and the U.K. And maybe Western Europe in terms of the behavioral science I'm seeing, is people are kind of maybe sensing a little bit of a staleness, and that's because the people doing the work have these ambitions to have an impact, to really be creative, be thoughtful about how they apply the research, do something that has a lasting impact. But the sort of constraints of the system mean they get kind of pigeonholed into doing certain types of work on certain projects, and maybe they're kind of not able to have an impact as much as they want. And I think at Busara, you guys are doing projects that are having huge impact, and more people would, I think, jump on to try and do this type of work, and you'd have like reinforcements basically if they knew about it, because I think there's a lot of people who are hungry, just like you, but in other parts of the world, to do that type of work. I'm not saying they'd come work for Busara necessarily, but I think your work could essentially inspire people's work to think bigger in the US. I really mean that. Like, I think if more people knew the scale and the scope of the work that places like Busara were doing, it would allow them to think bigger and maybe more systematically and more contextually than they currently are in the research that I'm seeing. And I think people have that hunger to think that way, but they don't have the example yet. And I think Busara can actually be an example to those folks. And kind of one other thing in that realm is, like, I think a lot of times when we talk about global north, global south, and behavioral science, that label just like colors everything. Basically, it's behavioral science from the developing world, or it's behavioral science from the global south. And I actually think, what's happening here isn't that. I mean, it is that, but it isn't that necessarily. It's basically really interesting behavioral science is happening here, and that's the thing that could even lead the conversation. Not that it's happening in a certain context, not to break the theme or anything, but the behavioral science itself happening here is really, I think, could inspire people to think more in other parts of the world. I have more to say on that, but I'll pause there.
Wonderful. I take that as an invite that you would like for more submissions from Busara, the behavioral scientist.
Definitely.
Wonderful. Happy to open it up to the audience for like a bit of 5-10 minutes of a Q&A session, and then I'll take it back as well.
Thanks so much for that. And I just wanted to contribute a little bit to the last point that you made in terms of, there's a point where we might have to transcend our context, the fact that we are behavioral scientists in the global south. And I think an important way for us to do this is also appreciate the uniqueness of the context that we're working in and what that can actually say for behavioral science across the world. Because I think right now our focus is really on just bringing the spotlight a bit more to Africa or to the developing world context to show that there is behavioral science here. But there's a lot that we've learned that can actually inform behavioral science across the world. So earlier this year, I presented a paper at MPSA, and it was on the influence that public service delivery, when provided in person versus digitally, had on citizen satisfaction and trust in government. And that was a study that was literally only possible in the context of Kenya, because we are the only place where you can get the same service from the government through either e-citizen or Huduma Center. So we were actually able to study that. And we were able to answer questions which researchers have really wanted to, but there's no opportunity to do so in other parts of the world. So it's important that we try to leverage our context to try to answer questions that can't be answered in other contexts, but also to be able to share those in a wider space than we currently are now, and not being limited by the fact that and not limit ourselves to the narrative of global South researchers, but researchers who are informed by the global South.
I think you just continued my point perfectly. So, no, I would say one thing I just want to build on that, but I think that's basically I 100% agree with that. And I think one analogy that I use, and it's kind of a very simple picture, but if you fly on a plane, in the back of the airline magazine, if you get bored, you end up flipping through it. In the back, there's there's routes of where the airline flies and all the different hubs they have. And I think if you drew a map of behavioral science knowledge, basically what we currently have is a lot of one-way trips from the US, the UK, and maybe some in Western Europe to the rest of the world. And I think that's such a boring map. So I think as I'm thinking as an editor over the next 5 years, 10 years, how I hope the field develops, I'm thinking about how do we get more hubs that are outside of the current existence? How do we get more origins? And how do we create more round trips, basically? So knowledge is passing both ways and originating in ways that we already know it's here. It just needs to kind of create that connection or build the hub and then find the route, basically. And kind of this is a very cheesy, I'm about to give a very cheesy metaphor. If the other one wasn't cheesy, this one is even cheesier. I kind of I go back to, I'm imagining, when humans were developing thousands and thousands of years ago, there's a group of, 25 people sitting around, and there's a handful of people, looking at the stars, figuring out what they do, and then there's a handful of people, looking at the plants, eating them, maybe hopefully not dying, a handful looking at the animals, and then there's basically where all of us would have been, the 2 or 3 people trying to figure out why does the person care about the stars, what's the person arguing with the guy in the plants, we're the ones who are watching everyone else and trying to figure that out, and if you play that out, there's always been that kind of us, basically, weird group of people, generation by generation by generation, and right now we're kind of in a really, really interesting time to be those people, which is because we have the opportunity to not just think about people in that little 25-person group, but think about it in a global context. And there's a whole bunch of knowledge that exists that isn't being communicated, but yet us as sort of the stewards now of the entire globe, thinking of behavioral science. Like we are not just the 25-person group or the 8 billion person group, and we're a very, very small number in that context, but we have the privilege and the responsibility to kind of be thoughtful and curious and asking those questions about human behavior and then communicating it back. I don't know, that's a cheesy thought experiment I like to think about. And it kind of puts it in perspective that we're also setting the stage for the next generation to ask interesting and thoughtful questions and communicate them, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. So my name is Freddie Carver. I'm an outsider to this space. Hi. I work for an organization called the Regional Durable Solutions Secretariat. And I'm not going to try to explain to everyone what those words mean because they don't mean very much, and that's part of the problem. But basically, we work on forcible displacement and forced displacement in this region. Refugees, IDPs, people who've been trapped in protracted displacement for all sorts of reasons for many years. And I've long been kind of thinking about the potential role of behavioral science in trying to help us kind of understand this issue in a different way. And I think one of the challenges is kind of there in the name of the field. I mean, we sort of assume that people are forced somehow. We've kind of removed their agency from even kind of getting into having this conversation. And so it makes it very, very hard to actually get into discussions about, well, what decisions are people making and how in the extremely difficult, challenging circumstances they find themselves in. And I think there's so much, just thinking about the previous session, that we could try and unpack and understand better if we could take a different approach. And it seems to me there's a lot in this space of research that could be really insightful and useful. So really my question is a bit niche. I hope it's okay, but it's just whether you've come across, given your kind of overview of the field, work in that space, looking at people's I suspect there's quite a lot in the sort of more traditional migration space, but particularly thinking about issues of forced displacement, of the circumstances of refugees, internally displaced people, what work you're aware of that's already happening in this space, and kind of your thoughts on what kind of work we should be doing more of. Thanks.
That's a great question, and I'm guessing there are people in this room who have way more expertise than me to answer that question, but I'll share a little bit about kind of the bits that I'm seeing. But I think the first answer I'll say is that's one of the routes that is not very well established. Some of the initial work on that of my knowledge, comes a lot from, I don't know this region as much, but in the Colombian region, I know more how they've dealt with the post-2016 peace agreement and the peace process, and how they've done that. And I think it's very similar to, I think, some of the work that Busara is doing, in that it's very contextual dependent, it's very creative, it's both qualitative and quantitative, it's ambitious, it's trying to do storytelling. But I would basically say that one of the reasons I'm here, one of the reasons I was in Colombia last week, was to start building the routes so more people know about these things. I would say the broader behavioral science world, kind of coming back to maybe something I said earlier, the broader behavioral science world, I think, would be interested in trying to answer that exact question. The researchers and the folks who are working with those types of populations, but it's typically not come under the behavioral science umbrella. And so I don't even think, my perception is that most people don't even know about it. And that's my perception on, when we were in Colombia, the focus was peace. And I don't think most mainstream people thinking about behavioral science are thinking about behavioral science and peace, and yet it's a really rich and impactful place to be applying your trade. And so I would basically say we need more work in that area. That's like an academic answer. And I think that's basically, I think we're at the start of trying to create that, and one of those ways we can do it is, I think basically we have to reach into the behavioral science world, and Busara is perfectly positioned to do that, to bring people into that conversation who would care about it and bring a lot of energy, maybe bring funding that they might have. So there's a lot of places, Busara can be a big bridge, a bridge builder to a lot of people who would help answer those questions.
Anyone else from the audience with a question? Yeah. two more here. Welcome.
Thanks, Ethan. Well, I was used to it, wasn't speaking. So it's common to hear that people don't read anymore, with attention spans reducing and so on. Why should we write?
Next question.
Actually, my follow-up is, do you have evidence that people are reading?
Next question. No, that's a great question. We do have evidence that people are reading behavioral scientists, and if you're not, then you should subscribe. We do a weekly newsletter. Marika featured in the piece we did on Colombia from a couple weeks ago, so there's a little bit of an incentive to sign up. So why should we write if maybe people don't read? I think part about thinking about human behavior and everything that you do is it's a little bit aspirational. I think we kind of have to be a little bit naive and idealistic to do the type of work we do, because we know how hard it is to do. I mean, I say we, but basically saying you, in terms of the science and all of those things. Those projects, I mean, I've been on them. I've been on big research projects before, doing more on the journalism and editing side. Those are really difficult projects, and it's a lot of time. There's a long lag between when the idea happens to when you finally get funding, to when you finally get to do something, to when you finally get to do the report. You have to have endurance, basically. And I think it's really hard, but it's aspirational. I think part about writing is like, we all kind of maybe wish we read more. We maybe wish we did other things more too. And so part of being at the sort of vanguard, and this may be special stewards of behavioral science, is thinking about not playing to the average, but setting the bar for people to reach to. And so I'm not going to say go write a War and Peace level size report, but I will say, it is worth writing, and I have more to say on that. And so maybe now is the good time to do it. But I kind of think of it as like a last mile problem, right? All of you have done really amazing projects, and you kind of, at the last mile of trying to really kind of maybe consolidate what you've learned, or write it up, or communicate it, that's where the drop-off happens, right? So projects to completion, write a project brief, delete the email from Michael, and then, or ignore it, or whatever happens. Sorry, Michael. But this is really a prompt to answer that email, which is basically to say, I think writing does a couple things, especially at the last mile. And I think it does a couple things in ways that aren't just about writing and whether people read, but about how you as a researcher and a citizen of the behavioral science community are acting, which is when you have to write something, you have to think really deeply about it. I know, Rahab, you and I spent 40 minutes just like asking each other questions back and forth until I really understood basically what you were doing in your project. And I hope it was helpful in clarifying. But there's a lot of people who are going to be coming into that type of project at the same level I am. And if you can get that communication right, you've now figured out as a scientist how to communicate it to folks. You've maybe clarified your thinking and learned along the way. So you've actually made yourself a better scientist and a better thinker by having to go through the writing process, which doesn't just stop on the page, basically. It goes to all the other projects you're doing. I also work with authors who write popular behavioral science books. And in that world, in the academic world, when people are doing that, there's often a lot of jealousy about when someone gets a popular book and it becomes famous. And I tell the person, like, write the book then. If you're going to talk a little bit of shit, excuse my language, about the person who's maybe getting a little bit of publicity or whatever, well, go ahead and write it and see how hard it is to actually do it. But I tell people, again, it's kind of a stepwise leap in your work when you start writing, because you're opening yourself up to your own internal criticism and like, wow, I really thought I knew what I was talking about. I got to go do more work to figure it out, actually. I got to have more conversations. But you're also opening yourself up to other people asking questions about your work. And a lot of times we hide behind that and not wanting those questions. But in the end, if your job is, and your kind of internal mission is to serve the people that you do, which I know it is from having all the conversations, you want to be a better researcher. And opening yourself to criticism from yourself and criticism from other people, constructive, will make you that. And it'll show up in your writing, it'll show up in your projects, show up in your thinking.
Great, thanks. Maybe before you take that question, my interpretation of Rahab's question was actually she's hesitant to write, right? So how can you encourage people to actually step up? In a way, Rahab knows. But also the other side is, and I'm sure folks will be signing up to the behavioral scientists, but if you were to recommend 3 books, say, that are non-negotiables for all behavioral scientists to read, what would they be?
3 books, huh? Okay. Well, I have to think about that. That's putting me on the spot a little bit because I think there's a lot of books that come to mind. I think there's one by Marika that just came out, so that would be number 1. I mean, essentially, I don't know if I would go as far to say these are the 3 books that you should read. I'm going to play the context card a little bit. I will say this. I think so for me, I'll give a personal example. For me, Barry Schwartz, the psychologist, is the author that I could keep coming back to his work and thinking more and more about because he's integrating a lot of different ideas. And he does it at these levels. And so maybe this is a little bit of a guide for as you're picking somebody who you might want to read over and over again. So Barry is asking a sort of philosophical question. He's using science to help answer it. And then he's saying, well, what does it matter in our day-to-day lives? So there's a philosophical level, a scientific level, and a practical level. And I don't think most writers are able to operate at those levels. Okay, I have to give 3, right? So, and if you want to read a book by Barry Schwartz that I think is really good, there are 2. One is The Battle for Human Nature, which he wrote in 1986. So, again, maybe predating many people in the audience. But it basically was written as a critique of the classic economic theory, the rational, self-interested maximizer. And that was sort of canon in those days. And so Barry's book was really trying to get at, really trying to take down what was the dominant narrative. Now we have behavioral economics and there's Nobel Prizes and things, and it doesn't seem like it was such a wall, but really it was a huge wall that he was trying to break down. And it goes to something that came up in one of, I think it was Marika's session, if you were in the gazebo in the first breakout. But this idea of what are we bringing what theories are we bringing to our science, and how does it impact how we're doing the science, how we're thinking about the results, how we're interpreting things? And Barry's work, I think, does that in a very specific way for behavioral science. So it'll be very practical to you. There's also a recent article on the website that is called, I think, Social Science Ideology and History, and it goes into this idea of social psychology as history. And is social psychology a sort of moving target? And it's really, the theme of context is really prominent there as a sort of layer. Okay, number 3, I would say find a fiction writer that, again, playing the context card, find a fiction writer that you really love that asks really interesting questions about human behavior, and then read those books, basically, because I think it's really refreshing to be able to have somebody ask interesting questions about human behavior where their starting point is like, what if? And they can invent worlds and invent people and things like that. Whereas, as scientists, you're kind of operating in a different paradigm, which is like, if, then, because, the sort of traditional hypothesis Mad Lib, basically. But I think, and so for me, that would be Kurt Vonnegut. I think he asks really interesting questions about human behavior. If you're really interested in technology at the moment and AI and what it might do to work and things like that, his first novel, Player Piano, we just ran a summer book club at Behavioral Scientists, reading that and having experts come and talk. So those would be my recommendations. So what was the Marika's book? Battle for Human Nature by Barry Schwartz, Player Piano by Kurt Vonnegut. And then, but adapted to your own situation.
Great. Thank you very much. There was a question at the back.
Yeah. Hi. So I think today we spent a lot of time talking about context, and one of the things, and I think this builds on a lot of what you've been saying already, but a lot of the conversations I was in, people are talking about the importance of being in the context, being immersed in the context, talking to people from that context informally. And I mean, you spent a week here, you've been talking to a bunch of people informally, you've had incentives in the form of stickers and keychains. So I don't know, you've done research, what are your insights, what are your takeaways? And I guess partly why I'm asking is I feel, we as researchers go somewhere and then generate knowledge from what we've heard. and it could be more than what people in that context already know. So I guess I'm wondering, like, you probably have insights that you think we might all know that we don't know. So, yeah, what have been your takeaways?
Okay, that's a good question. I think the world needs more of Busara, right? Okay, and I'm not just saying that. As an editor, I kind of have developed a sort of filter that I can't turn off. And if things meet the filter and it interests me, then I say it. If they don't, I don't. And I think I really think that there's a lot of people who would be super interested to hear about your work. Would be, again, not that they would come and do exactly what you're doing, but that they would take inspiration for it in solving the problems in their own communities in an ambitious and big way. So that's probably takeaway number one. I think takeaway number two, and it relates to that, is Busara is a really interesting behavioral science organization. Again, this organization, I'm guessing, if you lined up all the behavioral science organizations, this organization probably speaks more languages than any other organization. There are probably other factors that I would say are strengths that you all have that you might think about leveraging again, to go back to the first question, to bring this knowledge that you're generating out to the world. And I think as somebody who's an editor of a magazine that's supposed to be curious about human behavior, selfishly, I want more diverse, interesting questions about human behavior being asked all over the world. Because again, we have this very, sparse picture currently. And I'm really curious to figure out, to have someone tell me something that I just would have never even conceived of, that is in a different context, in a different world. So I guess I could summarize that as saying, speak up, because I think a lot of people would listen to what you have to say.
Anyone else from the audience? We've got time. Okay, cool. So maybe as we start wrapping up, one question I have is, you've written about the data crisis, you've written about a lot of stuff. You wrote about Thaler and Sustain, and kind of when they were publishing Nudge, if they could have predicted what would have happened, right, 10 or so years later. If you were to predict now, right, what's the future of behavioral science? What's that opportunity for Busara, organizations like Busara as well?
That's the question I usually get to ask and then laugh after I ask it. So thank you. I guess I get to be in the hot seat and take my own medicine a little bit. I don't know if I could predict where it's going to go, but I think there's something that both of the previous speakers were saying, which is, I think there's this desire for new voices around the world. I think, just again, from the media that I consume in the US and Europe, I think this is very tired, old narratives, old ideas, same ideas. It's being recycled over and over again. And I think if there are a lot of interesting and awesome ideas in Africa that nobody else knows about, again, for some of the reasons that we heard in the previous session. And so again, in the next 10 years, if I have to predict or hope or whatever, I would love to have the 5 things that are currently being talked about Africa in the media that we heard about not be those things, and be the things that can inspire other folks in the world. So that's not necessarily a behavioral science question, because I think, or a behavioral science answer, but I think that's where I'm hoping, and if you filter that down to the behavioral science world, I hope in 10 years, one, there's a bunch of Busara alumni around the world doing amazing different work, and bringing, I think, this contextual knowledge, this really deep, thoughtful approach to their work. So I hope there's more alumni and more people spreading out, and I hope they've influenced and had a really big imprint on the rest of the field. So it's not, again, I feel like a lot of the behavioral science that I've seen, and that kind of leaves me kind of like, this isn't great, because it feels ahistorical, it feels like it's plucked out of thin air, and it feels like it's done for the end result, not because they actually care about the question. Barry Schwartz has a saying that says, he picks up a paper, and we talk about the replication crisis. If he picks up a paper, and he said he was in a paper group out in Berkeley where there's a very prominent replication crisis person, Leif Nelson. And it's a very smart, amazing group of people in UC Berkeley having this paper club. But immediately the conversation goes to replication, which is super important. But Barry's point is always, if I pick up a paper and I don't care if it replicates, then what are we doing having that discussion? And I think that I would love to have, again, more papers and ideas and things that I'm seeing where I want to know if it replicates, basically, and I want to know more about the project. So that like definitely didn't answer the prediction question, so I sidestepped it. Let's see if I can predict something. No, I'm not going to do that.
No worries, I'll let you off the hook. I'm sure you might have an itch because you're always asking the questions. So what's one question that we haven't discussed today that you'd like to share as part of your final thoughts?
So I think something that's really been on my mind is something that came up when I was reading The Player Piano, and it's this distinction. I can't go into all of it, but it's interesting in that it's a distinction between know-how and know-what. So know-how you could think of as how do we, in the behavioral science context, how do I get people to sign up for something, right? It's the sort of mechanical problem. It's the engineering problem. And I think a lot of times in the behavioral science world, we can get pigeonholed into answering know-how problems. And one of the influences on Kurt Vonnegut's book was this mathematician from MIT who wrote, he predated AI and all of those things, and he basically said, look, the know-how, just knowing like how to do something, but not knowing what we're doing it for, what the purpose is, that's what gets us the atom bomb, basically. And that's the conversations they were having around the 40s and the 50s, so it was obviously on their mind. And I think behavioral science is at a really unique point where we have to figure out the engineering problem, we have to figure out the know-how problem, we have to figure out how do we get people to sign up and do all of those things. But because of all the work we do and thinking about people and the contextual thinking, we have a chance to answer the know-what problem. What's the purpose for what we're doing? And so there's I think there's a really unique opportunity to be sort of know-how engineers and know-what engineers. So combine the purpose with the how, that I think behavioral science as a field is kind of uniquely positioned to do. And I think it could actually teach engineers who might just want to build something for the sake of building it, or behavioral scientists who just want to get someone to do something for the sake of doing it, signing up, clicking a button, whatever, get a little bit more purpose into the conversation and show that there's a better way to do it. So I'd encourage you all to figure out how do I be a know-what engineer as well.
Wonderful. And with that, I believe we're on time. So I want to give a very heartfelt thank you to you, Evan. Thanks for joining us. And
thanks, everybody. Thanks, Francis.
Asante sana.